Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to look into today is the stalking of a woman named Laura Black and the mass murderer Richard Farley. He grew a deadly obsession with Laura, and when she didn't return his feelings, he decided to go on a rampage. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect to anyone I talk about today. I've just gathered this information from the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. So we begin in 1984 when Laura Black, who was 22 years old, had just been offered a job at a company called ESL Incorporated. She goes around for a tour, and this is when she meets a man named Richard Farley. Of course, Laura didn't have a clue how obsessed Richard would actually become with her. So she started a new job, everything went really well, she worked hard, but not long into her job, Richard began leaving gifts at her desk. He would leave baked goods, he would write letters to her, and at first Laura just tried to ignore it. She tried to just maintain a friendly relationship. She wasn't a malicious woman, so she wanted to be nice about it, but she wasn't really interested in it. The thing with Richard, which he would later actually claim, is that he felt like he immediately fell in love with Laura, like love at first sight, I guess, and he stated that he knew that they needed to be together, which of course Laura didn't. Before I go any further, let me just give you some background on Richard, because what happened kind of came out of the blue. And looking back at his actual history, there's no real sign of violence or anything like that, so it's a little bit of an odd case, this. He was born on the 25th of July in 1948 at the Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and he was the first out of 6 children that his parents had. Richard's father worked in military and his mother was a household wife, just a stay-at-home mum and wife. And his mother went on to state that there is no abuse in his childhood or anything like that, although there is some kind of dispute against that and some mixed views in a sense, but from what I couldn't find anything online to say that he had been abused or anything like that as a child. So take that as you will. He was said to be a well-mannered child who enjoyed playing chess in his spare time. He enjoyed doing things like baking. He was very well behaved and showed no signs of abuse. He went on to enlist in the US Navy and he graduated first in his class from the Naval Submarine School, but he quickly voluntarily dropped out of that. Then after basic had finished, he went on to be a crypto logic technician, which is actually someone who works with electronic equipment. So for his job, he had to have this really high clearance because obviously everything was so strict and whatnot. The military would actually check on him, I believe, every 5 years. So they would go around, they would ask people, they would try and find out information about him to make sure that nothing had changed in that time. And nothing ever had. He managed to keep this clearance for the 10 years that he was with the military. There were no problems whatsoever with him, and in 1977, after his discharge, he went on to buy a house, and that is when he began working for ESL, which stands for Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory. And there, he was a really good worker, he was always a top employee, and he, according to everyone, did a really good job. They said that he was a nice guy, he was always concentrating on his work, although sometimes he did come across as arrogant, and sometimes would brag about this gun collection that he had, but nobody sort of said anything bad about him apart from those things. So that's just a bit of his history. Let's get back to 1984. And Richard is becoming more and more persistent with Laura. He's asking her out all the time, he's constantly mithering her, he's constantly sending her letters and ringing her on her office phone, obviously, and that was most days he was ringing her on her office phone. Laura went on to join the ESL softball team and she went out doing matches of courses, and he was there. He turned up to every single one that she was in, which is weird and creepy. Like, she told him that she wasn't interested and he just wasn't having any of it. Laura also went to an aerobics class to help with her fitness. She liked to keep herself fit. And he began turning up at those too. Now, those were actually outside of work. The softball team was provided by work, so he could follow her straight out of work, I guess. But this one was actually completely nothing to do with work, completely her outside life, and he was there too. Even though she made it really clear he wouldn't date him, he obviously wasn't going to let it go. Richard was actually 36 years old at the time, and he just began escalating his behaviour towards Laura, who, as I said, was 22. Richard had no previous issues with mental health, he had no criminal record, and as I've told you, up until that point, he'd done nothing concerning whatsoever. Then, all of a sudden, Laura starts working at ESL. He sees her. He thinks it's love at first sight. He becomes obsessed with her, and his behavior just totally changes. He was stalking her, and he even went as far as to take some false information to ESL HR, and through that he actually managed to gain her address and her phone number. So now he knew where she lived, and he had a home phone number too. He would go on to drive by her house several times a day. And once more, he kept on writing her the letters. He would do that around 2 times a week at this point. He would then try and make friends with someone from the custodial department. Basically, he was trying to get a hold of Laura's office keys so that he could copy them, and then he would have access to her locked away personal items at any point, and he could just find out more information about her. He just carried on ringing her office, trying to contact Laura however he could. I have seen at some points he did stop with the letters, but then he would just quickly pick that back up again and just resume sending them. In total, Laura would actually receive 200 letters off Richard in the 4 years that he would stalk her for. He just wasn't letting her go. Laura made it clear she didn't want a relationship with him. They never had a relationship. They never had anything together. She never showed any interest in Richard whatsoever. She always politely told him no, and that obviously she was not interested. And yet in his head, I don't know what was going on. He was just obsessed with her, and he just continued to stalk her all the time. Wherever she went, whatever she did, he was there. Laura did everything she could to get away from him. She changed her number, and she actually changed her address. Between the dates of July 85 and February 88, she moved 3 times. She moved house 3 times to try and get away from Richard so that he didn't know where she lived. And yet he just found her address each and every time, and she just couldn't get away from him. He even went as far as, when she was on vacation, he called her parents up, and it was basically to threaten her and to let her know that he knew where her parents lived. And obviously she was scared. He was becoming increasingly more aggressive with what he was doing, and he was no longer kind of being friendly, but obviously you don't want to be stalked either way, whether it's friendly or not. It normally escalates. So he was no longer sort of doing the friendly bit and being more threatening and more aggressive towards it. And he was just getting more angry at her, because why didn't she love him like he loved her? Finally, in October of 1985, Laura had had enough, and she decided that she was going to go to HR and work. Now, she didn't know what else to do. You know, she tried a lot of things. She'd done a lot of preventative measures, and yet he still kept finding her and calling her all the time. And it's scary and it's irritating. You just want to get on with your life, and this person just will not leave you alone and will not stop pestering you. And now he's behaving more threatening and more aggressive, so she just didn't know what to do. She goes to HR and she tells them what he's been doing. They conducted an investigation, and they basically told him that he had to attend mandatory psychological counselling sessions, which Richard did do. He attended them, and for a little while they actually worked, but he quickly just went back to his old ways again and carried on stalking her. That was in December when he started it back up again, so it was 2 months later, if that. HR spoke to him again in December, and then again in January of 1986, which in both times he was actually given a written warning. This made him really angry, and he went and confronted Laura and told her that he was no longer gonna be nice to her, and he started threatening her. Now, as I've just said, stalking someone is not being nice. Yes, okay, he wasn't aggressive with her at first or sort of violent, but stalking is not nice. It's not friendly. It's not something anybody wants, and it's frightening. Somebody's there all the time watching you. No matter what you do, you can't get away from him. You move house, you change the number, he's there again. No, it's not okay. So how he thought that was being nice, I don't know. In spring of 1986, Richard, of course, was still stalking Laura. Co-workers knew about it, and there were reports that came out that they had tried to speak to him. He would get really angry and he'd threaten them with his large gun collection. And he'd also made other threats against other employees too. Due to poor performance, ESL decided to terminate his employment. He'd worked for them for 9 years at this point. But it wasn't just due to poor performance. As soon as he sort of started stalking Laura, his work began to fail and wasn't as good there for the performance, but he was harassing Laura and obviously stalking her. He was told to leave her alone and he didn't. He was threatening other employees, and so as a company, they couldn't have their staff members in danger. They have a duty to protect them. So he was exhibiting this strange behaviour and they had to terminate him because they had to protect everyone. The problem was that, yes, okay, he was now not in work, so he wasn't around Laura all the time in that sense, but that just gave him more time to stalk Laura because now he was unemployed. And what else would he do with his time apart from go and watch her do whatever he wanted to watch her do? So over the next few months, he would just stalk her all of the time, full time. Like, that was his full-time job now. He was increasing in his persistence and he just had, as I said, all the time in the world that he wanted to delve into this obsession. And in his eyes, he actually had more time to now try and win her over, which is basically what he did for the next several months. In the summer of 1986, he actually got a new girlfriend called Mei Cheng. They got engaged, but even that didn't stop him from his obsession with Laura, which, how that made his fiancée feel, obviously, it probably was not good. He would write to her and become increasingly more threatening and increasingly more violent. In one letter in November 1987, he wrote, "You cost me $40,000 in empty taxes that I can't pay and a foreclosure, yet I still like you. Why do you want to find out how far I'll go?" He ended the letter with, "I absolutely will not be pushed around and I'm beginning to get tired of being nice." In another letter he wrote to her, he said that he didn't want to kill her because he wanted her to have to live with the consequences of not responding to his romantic gestures. Which, seriously, Richard, she didn't like you in that way. You cannot force feelings on someone. They either happen or they don't, and in this case, they didn't for her. She was nice about it and you were just, I don't know, you just lost the plot. Richard did manage to get another job in Covalent Systems Corporation in Sunnyvale, but even though he now had a job to occupy his time and he wasn't around Laura all the time, it still didn't decrease his stalking of her. Yes, it did in the sense that he couldn't do it all the time like he was doing, but he just was still so obsessed with her. In January of 1988, Laura went out to a car to find a package on a windscreen. Inside it was a copy of a house key along with a note. It was from Richard and it was pretty much telling her that he could get her wherever she was, which is obviously frightening and it must have terrified her. He literally managed to get hold of her house key. It's just awful and insane how resourceful he was. How did he manage to get all of these things? I know it was the 80s and maybe it was a bit more lax then, but still. She was terrified at this point. She didn't have a clue what else to do and she felt like she was stuck, and so she went to go and get a temporary restraining order against Richard because what else could she do? It was granted on the 2nd of February in 1988 and he wasn't allowed within 300 feet of her or he wasn't allowed to contact her whatsoever. A court date was set on the 17th. As I said, it was temporary, this restraining order, so this court date was to try and make it permanent. Now, after hearing about this restraining order, Richard, from what I can only presume, was furious or desperate and he just literally snapped. He went off the deep end and he went and bought a shotgun and a lot of various other weapons and ammo. Now, he boasted about his gun collection at home. He didn't actually use any of them. He went and bought new ones in what he was about to do. And he spends around $2,000 on it all. Apparently, when you had a restraining order against you, you could still buy guns and ammo and things like that. But I do believe that the laws have since changed. I'm also just going to add something in here which, personally, I found just unbelievable. He actually, when he finds out about the restraining order, so what does he do? He rings his solicitor and he takes Laura out of his will. So, yes, he had literally put the woman that he'd been stalking for years into his will. He was just insane. She didn't want anything to do with him and he full on goes and puts her in his will. Just wow. On the 9th of February in 1988, Richard goes to Laura's attorney's office and he left a package there for him which he claimed was proof that he and Laura was in a relationship. He claimed that they were photographs taken while they were together, whilst they were on a date. It also had Laura's garage door opener in it, which of course he's probably stolen. It had these hotel receipts and credit card receipts that he said proved that they were together, and her solicitor looked at all this evidence and basically dismissed the entire lot, saying that it was just an utter fabrication of any relationship ever happening, which of course it was. Laura didn't have a relationship with him. It was all in his head. Then on the 16th of February, the day before the court date to make this restraining order permanent was due to happen, Richard rents out a motorhome and he drives it to ESL, where of course Laura still worked at the time. He would later say that he sat there waiting for Laura to leave, waiting to catch her on her own, to try and convince her to drop this restraining order. And his plan was that if she wouldn't do, he was going to kill himself. But this is so far from what he actually did. So this motorhome that he brought, he actually turned it into some sort of military arsenal with all the weapons that he purchased from the store, all of the ammo, loads of gear, all shoved inside of it. He had tons of ammo, tons of guns, and he was just ready for a battle. At 3 p.m, he loaded it all up, and as I've said, there were a lot of guns. There was a semi-automatic gun, a pump-action shotgun. He had a rifle with a scope. And I believe there were like 4 or 5 other guns that he took with him. He also took a smoke bomb and a buck knife. When he got there, he had this military outfit on. He had a bulletproof vest, a scarf wrapped around his head with earplugs and leather gloves on. He loaded himself up with several guns, including 12-gauge Barnelli Riot semi-shotgun, a Ruger M77 22 250 rifle with the scope, and as I said, 4 or 5 more guns, which he actually had on his person. So he had all of these guns and he was going into that building. He had around about 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and once he'd got himself loaded up, he jumps out of the motorhome and he is in the parking lot of ESL. He begins heading towards the building, and that is where he shoots his first victim, Larry Kane, as he was heading towards the building. As he got closer, he just began shooting people, anyone that was in his path. He shot through a glass security door at the front, and that is how he got in the building. And once he was inside, he headed up to Laura's office, shooting anyone he could in his path. Arriving there, he opened the door, but Laura slammed it back in his face, and he shot through the door, but he actually missed the first shot. Laura locks the door in an attempt to try and protect herself, but he's got a gun. He just shoots through the lock, barges through the door, and he shoots her pretty close range with the shotgun in her left shoulder. Now, as you can imagine, a shotgun in a shoulder is gonna obliterate it, and that's what it did. It shattered her shoulder, and it also punctured up one of her lungs. Laura collapsed and fell unconscious, and I guess when he sees her on the floor not moving, he probably thinks that she's dead, and so he then moves on. He was now looking to get anyone he could. He was literally looking under desks for people that may have been hiding, and he would shoot everywhere, and literally one person actually got shot through a wall, so he's just randomly shooting everywhere, and one comes through the wall and hits someone. Police were called and SWAT team arrived and snipers were arranged to get a shot on Richard, but he kept moving from room to room and they couldn't get a clear shot on him. A hostage negotiator did manage to get through to Richard, and they talked on and off over the 5-hour siege. I will play a snippet of the clip. It's just really to show how unremorseful he sounded. He just sounds completely normal, completely fine, not like he's just shot up and is holding hostage an entire building.
Eventually feels good enough to come out and talk about this and nobody else gets hurt.
Well, did you go up on the second floor yet and check that out? The 2 hallways I gave you?
No, I told you we would not do that unless we told you we were going to be doing
Oh, okay. Because I'd hoped you guys, I mean, if anybody's laying there wounded or something like that, I don't know.
Laura managed to regain consciousness and she contacted the police too. She went on to hide with other people that were hiding inside the building, and the police did manage to aid Laura and the other hostages after the 5 hours because they actually managed to get Richard to come out. How, you may ask? How are they getting this guy who is completely loaded up with guns on a complete rampage after 5 hours to come out of this building? Well, he got hungry. He finally surrendered after asking the police for a sandwich and a soft drink. They, of course, went to get it for him, and he came out to collect it, and then he was arrested. That day, Richard did murder 7 people, and 4 more people were wounded. Here is a list of his victims' names that unfortunately lost their lives that day. Lawrence J. Kane, who was 46, Wayne Buddy Williams Jr., who was 23, Donald G. Downey, 36, Joseph Lawrence Silver, 43, Glenda Moritz, 27, Ronald Stead Reed, 26, and Helen Lampowder, 49. And the 4 victims that he injured were, of course, Laura Black, Gregory Scott, Richard Townsley, and Patty Marcotte. In total, the police concluded that Richard actually fired a total of 98 shots. 98 shots. This seemingly previous normal guy who had no warnings of anything, no indication of any violence until Laura came along. It's just crazy. Laura was taken to hospital where she was treated for her injuries, and she was actually released 19 days later. Imagine how terrified these people must have been in this building with this shooter going around just shooting everyone, and how scared Laura was when she woke up. She'd survived his attack, and she probably was petrified that he was going to come back to finish off the job. And the poor people that lost their lives. Just how many lives were actually affected by this one man is just heartbreaking. Richard would write another letter to Laura whilst he was in jail, basically telling her that she'd won. Like it was some sort of game for him. No, she hadn't won. Yes, she was free of him. Luckily, she survived his attack, but she had to recover and live with what he did to her. And she had to live knowing that 7 lives were destroyed that day, 7 families were destroyed that day, and they had to live without the person that they loved. There's just no winning in it. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what he's thinking throughout all of it, of course. It's just inexplicable. Richard admitted killing the 7 people, but he pled not guilty because he claimed that he never actually planned to kill anyone that day. He was only aiming to get Laura's attention or to kill himself in front of her. Which, of course, why do you need all them guns, Richard? Why do you need all that ammo if you're just going to go and kill yourself in front of her? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. His attorney claimed that he was never a violent man before and he never had a criminal record, which he didn't. Before, obviously, his obsession with Laura, of course. And that this obsession with her clouded his judgment. He said Richard would never likely kill again. But that doesn't... I don't understand that personally because he literally snapped through seeing a woman one time and becoming completely obsessed with her, and it escalated over the years and it ended in a mass murder, basically. How can you promise that he's never going to do that again, that he's never going to see another woman and just become so obsessed with her that he does something like that again? You can't. You just can't do that. The prosecution, however, had every case of stalking all documented down that he'd done to Laura. They had all the letters that he'd sent to her. They found purchases of the guns and the ammunition. And they had evidence that this attack took a lot of planning and that it was premeditated, as I said. On the 21st of October in 1991, Richard was actually found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death on the 17th of January in 1992. There have been several appeals since, however, Richard still remains on death row. Personally, I'm really glad that he did come out of the building. I know he killed 7 people, which is horrific, and that loss of life is absolutely heartbreaking, but he could have killed so many more too. So the fact that he came out because he was hungry was just a godsend, really, because as I said, he just could have done so much more damage, and that is something to be thankful of in the wake of such tragedy. I'm also happy to see that Laura survived because she had suffered for 4 years of him stalking and threatening her, and she literally took a shot point blank to the shoulder from a shotgun where the shells just disperse and rip you apart. And she survived. She managed to get the chance to move away from the insanity of all that. I know, obviously, it would traumatize her and weigh heavily on her, and 7 people lost their lives. And my heart really does go out to the victims and all the families and everyone that was involved in this tragic case when a seemingly normal man callously stole their lives away from them. Laura went on to say that Richard was frighteningly normal. He was irritating because he wouldn't stop annoying her, but he didn't seem like a bad person until he snapped, which is actually a really scary thought when you think about it. But yeah, that's the end of the case. If you have any suggestions you'd like me to look into, let me know and I'll look into them for you. Give me a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for similar content. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Laura Black and the Sunnyvale Murders. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.